Hey everyone, welcome to Scared Yet. This is a channel that I've been dabbling in for almost a year now, and I gotta say I've never been more happy to tell scary stories for the world to listen to. Whether this reaches a large audience or not, I just want to express my appreciation and thanking those who have taken the time to listen. Your time is the most valuable thing that you can give, and for me to have that little bit of time in your life is more than I can ever think. So thank you on that note. Anyways, well, tonight's story is pretty much a Home Alone story. So if you're home alone, well, good luck, and hopefully it doesn't scare you too much. But it's a really good story. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. And anyways, sit back, relax, and please get some well-deserved sleep. And I'll see you guys on the next one. See ya. Someone keeps slipping notes underneath my bedroom door, but I live alone. There was a strange noise coming from downstairs, feet resounding against the wooden floor. But why did they sound so uneven? It might have been a strange walking nightmare. I had been having trouble sleeping lately. When Mom called the next morning, I didn't mention the sounds, or the headaches, or the nausea.
Are you sure you're feeling okay?
She asked.
Maybe I should come home early.
No, I'm fine, trust me.
She was always so overprotective. That night, the noise kicked up again as something boomed up the staircase. My limbs froze. I sat perfectly still and listened carefully. The house was ghost quiet. It was probably just a fever dream. Sleep came in short bursts. One day drifted into the next. The courage to leave my room only came when it was bright outside. Each time I stood up, my stomach churned like it would on a roller coaster, and I couldn't shake the feeling like hidden eyes were crawling all over my skin. The footsteps thudded again, faster than before. They made their way through the upstairs hall and stopped right outside my bedroom door. A floorboard creaked. My eyes bulged out of their sockets as four tiny appendages reached under the door. A child's fingers. A scrap of paper slid into the room. Then the sound moved down the hall. I leaned over the edge of the bed. In front of me was a note. It said, "You aren't safe. Just a fever dream." If Mom knew what was happening, she'd race straight home. So I kept lying whenever she called.
Everything's fine, I just need to rest.
Another scrap of paper slid into the room. This one had a crayon drawing of a monster clutching a knife. There were words scribbled beneath it. "Pigman is coming." Imaginary spiders scurried across my back, sending a shiver along my spine. What was a pigman? My nightmares became plagued with flashing images of terrible snouts and hooved feet. In one, a group of ferocious hogs chewed at my stomach lining, while I lay on an oak table. The shiny red apple lodged in my throat stifled my screams. When I woke up, the pillow was soaked with sweat. Fever dreams. When I next heard the sound, it was dashing up and down the hall. It moved through the house, opening and closing drawers. The sound disappeared into my parents' bedroom, producing a thudding echo. Then, stillness. I went back to sleep. The following morning, there was a photo album on my parents' bed. Opened at a picture of two children. There was a baby, who I recognized, and a girl, who I didn't. She looked strangely familiar, though.
Do I have a sister?
I asked my mom, staring at the photo. She paused for a moment, as if confused by the question.
What?
Do I have a sister?
I repeated.
You know you don't.
But did I ever have one?
She said nothing. I spoke in an assertive tone,
Did I ever have a sister? Answer me.
You're delirious. Your father and I are gonna catch the next flight home.
I got Dad's shotgun from the tool shed. Would it hurt a ghost? Probably not. But having it made me feel safe. She was back. And what's worse, I was too sick to stand. It felt like I was trapped inside of a furnace. My mouth was dry with terror. The bedroom door creaked open, then something crossed the room. I craned my neck and saw her. The girl from the photo. She was about 7. Her frame was bent, each limb wrenched at an extreme angle. One foot pointed sideways, and there was a naked skull. She watched me, unblinking, and my breathing stopped. The little girl looked scared. For some reason, that terrified me. She spoke in a quiet voice.
Please, don't go back to sleep. Pigman is coming.
She vanished. Terrible images of humanoid pigs flashed through my mind. It took every last ounce of strength my body could summon to stand and face the door. A new noise came from downstairs. These footsteps were different from the others. They were heavier, more ominous. It was how a pig man might have sounded. I couldn't help think. The adrenaline pumping through my veins barely kept me awake. The barrel of the gun trembled. The footsteps passed through the kitchen into the dining room. The sound of its maker was traveling through the house in a stealthy sort of way, like it didn't want to be heard. The footsteps climbed the stairs. They were slow and careful, deliberate. Doors opened and closed throughout the house. The pig man was searching for something, or someone. My head was swimming. The steps came to a halt outside of my room. Panic swelled in my chest. I could feel a heavy presence, bestial and vicious, on the other side of that door. This was no fever dream. The handle turned, but why did the pig man want to come in so badly? I hid behind the door. A looming presence, so tall, it had to duck through the frame just to step inside. I bit my bottom lip so hard it drew a trickle of blood. The shadowy figure craned its neck, surveying the room. When it finally settled on me, I saw a hideous snout and 2 dark sunken holes. My pulse skyrocketed. Without warning, it lunged forward. I squeezed the trigger. The shot was deafening. The figure staggered back and hit the wall, staining it red. I reloaded. Before I could fire again, the figure disappeared. A trail of thick, dark blood receded down the hall and around the corner. I heard the pigman tumble down the stairs, grunting all the way. The walls started bobbing from side to side, as though I was standing on a boat caught in a fierce storm. The last thing I remember is the light bulb swirling above my head. When I woke up, a paramedic was hunched over me. 2 police officers were standing behind him. The neighbors had heard the gunshots and called the authorities. They found a man wearing a rubber pig's mask crawling through the backyard. He was later identified as the one responsible for a series of fatal home invasions. I told the police what happened, leaving out the part about the girl, but they said I was lucky to be alive. When my parents got home, they made a huge fuss, of course. Mom insisted I stayed in bed and checked my temperature 50 times a day. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to ask her again whether or not I had a sister.
Why would you think that?
She asked. I told her about the photo of me as a baby and the girl I didn't recognize. She clutched her chest.
The truth is, you had a sister. Her name was Abby. She died in a car accident when you were less than a year old. We were waiting for the right moment to.
Her voice trailed off. We cried and hugged. Later that night, after both my parents had gone to sleep, I heard the footsteps one final time. Another scrap of paper slid underneath the door. This one was a crayon drawing of me holding hands with a little girl like the one in the photo. Hovering above us was a purple heart. When I woke up the next morning, my fever broke. My brother went missing 30 years ago. I just found him in my basement. When someone you love just disappears, it messes with your entire life. For me, it was my 13-year-old brother David. I loved my older brother so much. At that time, we were living in one of those oldest houses in town. Our house was built sometime in the late 1700s. On the night when Hugh went missing, I remember my parents weren't home that night for whatever reason, but back in the 80s, it was considered okay to leave your kids home alone. Me and my brother were both sitting on the floor in the living room, listening to the radio. My brother asked me to fill him a glass of Hawaiian punch. After that, I went to the kitchen and poured him a glass. But when I came back, he had completely vanished from the living room. I remember that exact moment as clear as day. I thought he was playing a trick on me. I played along, but when I searched every room in that damn house, not a hair was out of place. He couldn't have gone outside because I was by the front door the whole time, and the windows were sealed shut since the previous owners. The basement door in the living room was wide open, the only place he could have gone. When I left to fill up his drink, it was shut. I was horrified of the basement as a kid because there's no electricity down there, and it literally looked like a dungeon. I yelled his name from the top of the stairs countless times, but he never answered. Even though I was 11, that basement still scared me. I remember that night sobbing uncontrollably, and when my parents finally pulled into the driveway the next morning, I was in tears when I told them about David. My mom and dad checked the whole house. I then told Dad about how the basement door was wide open, and when he walked down there into the basement, I remember sitting on the couch next to the basement door, hoping my dad would walk back up with David. But when Dad walked up those stairs, his face had gone completely pale. In his hands were my brother's clothes from the night before. I can't describe how horrified I was. He dropped them onto the ground and walked upstairs to where Mom was. I then got on the ground and crawled towards the clothes, exactly what my brother was wearing before he disappeared. I sorted through them, everything he wore that night: shirt, the pants, underwears, socks, everything was stripped from him. I could hear my parents' voices from upstairs. My mother then came sprinting down the stairs and got on the phone with the police. My dad ran outside and onto the field. When the police finally arrived, all of them thought he must have gone outside and got lost in a nearby forest. But I knew for a fact he was in that house. The police officers spent weeks searching the woods and fields near our house. They closed the case about a half a year later. The entire town assumed it was a kidnapping. I knew it was something to do with that basement, but I could never get myself to go down there. After his disappearance, life continued for our family. We turned David's bedroom into a guest bedroom. I hated how my parents did that. It felt like they were trying to move on. I was unable to, though. Losing David, my brother, was a huge damper over my entire family. Something that would hang over our heads for our entire lives. Mom's way of coping with the grief was just erasing all memory of him. I hated her guts for that. Every time I looked at the basement door, growing up, I I could feel something behind it. I remember one day when I was 16, I was putting DVDs away in the living room. I was sitting a few feet away from the door and I smelled something familiar. The smell was seeping through the cracks of the door. It was what my brother smelled like. I know that sounds weird, but if you're family, you're family. The entire room smelled like David's old bedroom. It was pitch black, but I knew he was there. I started screaming his name. I screamed his name for hours until Dad finally came down. Dad couldn't smell it though. He thought I was insane. I remember I couldn't talk for weeks after that. Nowadays, it's been nearly 30 years since his disappearance, and I can say that it's been a long 30 years without him. I'm now living alone in about an hour or so away from my childhood town. I had to get out of there as soon as possible. When I turned 18, I started looking toward apartments in town, and by my 20th birthday, I was out the door. My parents continued living in that house. My mom developed stage 3 breast cancer about 3 years ago and was forced into a group home closer to the hospital. My father was given the option to move with her and sell the home, but he decided to stay there and continue farming. My mother and father had a tough relationship ever since I left the house, so Dad didn't quite mind the quiet. Later on, my dad fell off his tractor and broke his knee and is now unable to walk without a cane. He then moved in with Mom and then sold me the land for free and insisted I moved back into that house. But I wanted nothing to do with that house. I had to pay property taxes for the house on top of my own. I then allowed tenants to move in. They were a young couple, late 20s. Of course, my stubborn old man was angry with me for letting a desperate couple live in that vacant house. They've been living in that house for almost a year now, and they called me up last week complaining about a decaying smell coming from the basement. By that time, I had learned to adapt from David's death. That was the biggest mistake of my life. I woke up early the next morning and drove to the house as promised. It felt odd driving back there. Those fields, it all felt so familiar. I tried not to think about how scared I was of that basement growing up. Fortunately, though, my dad finally added electricity down there. I pulled into the driveway. They were both waiting for me outside. They said it smelled like something was rotting down there. I had everything I'd be needing: asbestos mask, medical gloves, even eye protection. I worked as an air duct cleaner a few years ago, so I have some background knowledge. I walked into the house and headed for the basement door. I never seen what it actually looked like down there until now. I opened the door and could immediately smell it. Something was rotting in there. I turned on the light switch. Ahead of me was an empty room. It was small, looked to be about 15 by 10 feet big. This basement had been haunting me for years. Seeing it with lights on felt off. The walls were stone, except for one. Out of all the walls, one was made of wood. The smell was clearly coming from the wood. The wood was rotting. I walked over to it and I started tearing pieces of rotten wood off the walls. The light started to seep into the other side. There was a secret room in this basement. I stopped and in front of me, I saw what looked like human flesh. I couldn't describe how horrified I was. I would rather go to hell than relive that terrible moment. I started smashing through that wall with all the force in my body until it finally gave in. The creature in front of me, just the sight of it, made me want to claw my eyes out. It was in a fetal position. The skin wasn't pale, it was white, and it looked like the flesh had been melted to the bones. The fingernails and toenails stretched halfway across the room. The worst part of that, it wasn't dead. It was breathing. It was alive. "David?" I said in a terrified voice. It slowly lifted its head and looked at me. The face looked completely mutated. But those eyes were my brother's eyes. It tried to speak. It tried with everything in it. That thing was my brother David. I had so many questions. How was he alive? What did he eat? How could he breathe? What the hell is happening? I kept the questions to myself. That was my brother in that basement. This whole time he's been in that damn basement. I didn't say another word to him. I ran upstairs and out to my car. I opened the glove box and grabbed my gun. By the time I got back downstairs, David had stood up, dragging his long nails behind him. He growled. I then shot him in the head. At the top of the stairs were the tenants questioning the gunshot. They walked down the stairs to investigate, but by the time I heard them scream, I was already out the door and backing out of their driveway. I didn't shoot David, my brother, because I was scared of him. I shot him because of how awful the situation was. That was 2 days ago. I've been driving ever since. The only time I stopped was to fill my gas tank. I don't know where the hell I am. Last time I checked, it said it was Kansas. I don't know what to do. Should I join David in the afterlife? Or should I just try to move on? I got into a rap battle with my sleep paralysis demon. I go to work, I do my job, I come home. I have no friends, but no enemies. I don't bother anyone or unfairly infringe upon anyone's time. I'm ordinary, admittedly predictable and dull. My aspirations, the few I have left these days, aren't fantastical, aren't even that interesting to me. Things towards which I can look forward if I ever did something with my life beyond the routine into which I've settled. To put it simply, I'm boring. And I don't think it's out of line to expect sleep, the only time during which I can exist free of stresses and worries, to be similarly, appropriately boring. But that wasn't the case. Well, last night, I had a conscious experience, a waking nightmare that'll forever haunt me, regardless of what state of consciousness I happen to be in. I hadn't had anything out of the ordinary, at least for my typical dietary habits. An omelet, spiced with a little bit of black pepper and cumin, loaded with diced onions and cheap cheese that hardened rather than melt under the heat. A piece of whole wheat toast, burnt perfectly into a delicious, crunchy, blackened square, washed down by equally black coffee, sipped directly from the pot. The entire thing emptied within an hour. I know you may already have your mind made up. The greasy, less than nutritious omelet, the extreme intake of caffeine. No wonder my overtly excited mind conjured up the infernal thing a few hours later, right? But I swear to you, this was a rather typical dinner, and I hadn't ever before dreamt up something so appalling, so viciously awful. This was a first-time experience. Hours later, after my post-work ritual of video games, cartoon sitcom clips from YouTube, ASMR, and other nightly habits I wish to not discuss, conducive to sleep, I finally settled into bed, my brain steeped in reward chemicals, my nerves overwrought by the day's sensations and stimulations. A day of thoughtless exertion, a night of dimly enjoyed consumption, rote, routine, unfulfilling, yet inescapable. Tingle immunity, a dubious condition resulting from the overindulgence in the dubious sensation of ASMR, was what had plagued me in the nights leading up to last night's psychological and undeniably physical attack. My usual triggers, stimuli that elicit the relaxing tingling throughout the nervous system, had been failing me lately, had lessened in their familiar effectiveness. So I'd resort to listening to two different sources of ASMR at once. In one ear, a Bluetooth earpiece relayed fast tapping sounds from my phone. In the other, a regular corded earphone played unintelligible whispering via my PS4's controller, with my TV bathing the room in the lights from the accompanying video. Unlike a lot of people, I assume, I can sleep in a well-lit room if I'm being serenaded by those mic-eating cyber sirens. I laid on my back, eyes closed, unbothered by the images and light playing upon my face and ceiling. My thoughts, mostly centered around breakfast in the morning, quickly lost cohesion, and my mind fell comfortably, plummeted pleasantly into the bottomless gulf of mental uncreation, that restful pit wherein the day's anxieties and unpleasantries could be thrown and left to sink endlessly until the self-flagellating brain endeavored to retrieve them in the morning. I'd almost done it, almost checked out for the day, when suddenly, as if remembering something important, all the webs and roots of sleep were untangled and dislodged from my mind. I was immediately forced into a disturbing, hypnopompic state in a way that made the discordant binaural ASMR extremely uncomfortably distracting. My first instinct was to unplug my ears and pause the video, but not exit out the app of YouTube. I felt the video's illumination was direly important. But I quickly realized that I could not move. From my toes to my scalp, I was completely frozen. Couldn't even manage to furrow my brows. And yet, I was entirely aware of myself and my surroundings, completely in control of my thoughts, terribly sensitive to the sounds bombarding my ears, the lights in my eyes. As if something had sensed my growing discomfort, the videos were paused, their sounds abruptly and mercifully cut off. I looked around, as much as my peripheral vision would allow, but saw only the walls and furniture of my bedroom. I hadn't looked at my ceiling, not at first at least, which, if you remember what I was saying earlier, I was laying on my back. But some part of me, some evolutionarily developed safeguard accompanying my human intelligence, had prevented me from looking at the ceiling. This safeguard, programmed to do whatever it takes to uphold human sanity, hadn't wanted me to see the thing on the ceiling, the monstrous thing clinging onto it. I've had nightmares before. I've seen evil-looking things cloaked in darkness, hidden in the shadows of corners, or crouched upon desks and dressers. Things unwholesome and wicked that glared at me with baleful eyes, that cackled like hell-freed fiends. These nightmares aren't unusual. I've had dozens of them in the 26 years of my life. I'm sure you have too, but that thing, that black, physically protean thing, undulating, pulsing, retracting upon itself, was unlike anything I'd seen before. Those aforementioned incubi of deep, partially broken sleep become visually innocuous, cartoonish in nature, when compared to that ceiling-spanning horror. Imagine floating in the air, facing down flatly, towards a densely packed forest. You can't see the ground. The collective canopy of trees appears to you as one massive, uneven curtain. The rough, prickly hide of some planet-hugging beast, a wind sourceless and ceaseless, passes through the forest, causing the trees to shift wildly, irregularly, throwing their tops and branches haphazardly against one another. But the collisions are soundless, the buffeting entirely inaudible to you, even though you're hovering just meters above the terrestrial violence. That is a rough approximation of the thing on the ceiling. Staring at it, frozen on my bed, I felt as if I were the vertically dominant one, as if I hovered above its place of rest, observing its nightly tossing and turning. To say that I was afraid that this thing elicited what you, the luckily inexperienced, could fathom as fear is an abysmal understatement. There is a supreme, barely cognizable terror in the ignorance of something's true nature. To not know whether an unknown thing is a creature or merely a force is inexpressibly unsettling. If I had known then that it was a creature, if that were a given, and the question was simply whether or not it was intelligent, I wouldn't have been as terrified. But without even that knowledge, with the uncertainty being its status as a thing of life, or a thing some other, unrelatable animation, it was horrible. Another cause for terror, but relatively minor in comparison, was that the light from the TV seemed to avoid the thing, or be entirely absorbed upon contact with it. The photons simply did not reach it, did not rest upon it, did not reflect off of it, were not transmitted from the television to the ceiling in any way detectable to human sight. This photic rejection, the recognition of the unreal phenomenon, at least alone would have driven me to panic. But coupled with my inability to categorize the thing, it was fuel on the already raging fire, transforming my terror into a conflagration that set aflame my heart. The organ beat rapidly within the chest, as if it sought to make up for the movements my limbs would have made had they the privilege to do so. A moment of luck, an opportunity for my physical and psychological salvation arrived in the form of a fallen earbud. My body must have been trembling violently, the thrum of my heart rocking it from within like an overworked cog ready to come loose in a mechanism. Because my left earpiece fell out, an issue entirely personal that I'd had with them was that the buttons which allows you to increase the volume or skip the presently playing track are incredibly sensitive. Brushing my ear or pressing an earbud further in would almost always result in a change of volume or song. When the earbud fell, the 2-inch fall from my pillow-raised head to the mattress caused just such a reaction. The paused video on my phone was swapped out for another, and this video had an ad before it. This ad, this faithfully played, hopefully monetized introduction, saved my life. The content, the objective of the advertisement is entirely irrelevant. The most important thing about it was the song that accompanied it. I don't listen to rap. I have nothing against the genre. I just like guitar riffs and would rather listen to Arkspire than Kendrick Lamar. I am, however, familiar with rap, having grown up during a time when Linkin Park, Eminem, and Lil Wayne could be found on a preteen's iPod, regardless of whether or not they actually enjoyed those artists. So, I have a passing understanding of the genre's fundamentals, if you will. This ad played from my dislodged earbud, and because ASMR is typically quiet and auditorily intimate, it played the ad's music loudly. Since my volume is at near max when listening to calming sounds, I heard the song, which was entirely unfamiliar to me. Above me, the tempestuously clashing mass jerked and swayed in a manner that was still horrible, but horrible in a noticeably different way. There was a receptiveness about it. Rather than a blind, idiotic convulsing, it was, I realized, listening to the rap music. The ad finished, the music ceased, and the video began. This was another ASMR video, so the sounds were virtually inaudible. I could barely hear them. With my ear inches away from the earbud, the thing above me could not, and I discerned this by yet another shift in its topological turbulence. Despite the utter lack of any features that could, by any lens, be interpreted as human, I sensed an emotion somewhere between confusion and anger in the violent thrashing. I thought then that it would fall, that it would detach itself from the ceiling and crush or consume me, but instead, something else, arguably as awful, happened. It spoke. The voice was plainly that of a rapper, but borrowed. I don't say imitated because this was not an imitation. Somehow, and I truly believe this, the thing had captured the sonic emissions and repurposed them, had unmade and reconstituted them to speak its thoughts in the voice of that briefly heard, unnameable lyricist.
You there, back there, I've come to feed my land and cry. I'm sure you've paid. Take a look at my face. I'm a superior race, an intergalactic gangster. It's the cosmic I chase. I'm haunted in dreams. Your mind is at the things. Your sheets are wax, and we both know that ain't sweat. Sickly little sleeping, slumped as a slave. Stupid little dreamer, you won't wake again. I'm a hypnopompic, whore, hypnagogic, hell-raising. A heart goes for hour later.
I was, as you'd probably be, stupefied. The thing had just rapped at me, awkwardly too, braggingly. If I hadn't already been rendered so, I would have gone limp, stricken with a fright-begotten palsy by the bizarre introduction. It resumed its original states of violence, forest-like topographical instability, which I took as a waiting for a response. I tried to speak and found that I could. My tongue had been immobilized, or maybe had been given the freedom of movement so that I could respond to the strange verses. When I asked why it was doing this, its pitch-blacked face shifted, slightly in a way that bespoke of a lack of understanding. I tried a few other questions, and these were similarly received, without comprehension. Then it dawned on me that the rap music had probably been its first experience with human speech. It was expecting a reciprocation of rhymed verses. And thus began the rap battle with my sleep paralysis demon. I apologize in advance for the shame I assuredly brought to the genre in my attempts to communicate with this eldritch lyricist.
So, I'm just trying to sleep, yet you're bothering me like some cosmic creep. You're scaring me, man. I'm not afraid to admit that, but I'm not no coward. I'll still hit back. Stuck to the ceiling, trying to hurt my feelings. Darker than the night. You think you're ready for a fight? Better call a fire station. These verses will start a conflagration. People will congregate just to see your incineration.
After a moment of silence, during which I assume it was mentally processing my poorly composed lyrics, the thing responded excitedly.
I am the beginning, I am the end. I'll keep your head spinning while I terrorize your kin. Thoughtlessly you thought, those fledgling feeble phrases. You're a tic-tac-toe to my lyrical mazes. To hell and back I've gone, a winter vacation. Through time and space I've flown, a short destination. In lightless voids I've watched the eclipse of prime creation. In sub-dimensions I've slept, a cozy two-dimensional hibernation. You can't beat me, mortal.
I shuddered, the most movement I'd exhibited since lying down to sleep. The thing's verses were far superior to mine. Even though it had only just come to understand human language quickly, for fear of being bombarded by more scathing verses, I blurted out a reply.
You brag, you self-aggrandize, thinking you've won some prize for those childish verses you've memorized. Hell is a joke compared to the heats I'll give. The feats I've lived, I'm lyrically combative. Crawl out of this place and get out of my face. Teleport your faceless mass into outer space. I'm done with you, creature. You're nothing but a feature. This song is on my album. I'm your music.
I was sweating. The mental exertion of having to come up with rap lyrics on the fly was worse than doing mental math as an adult that hadn't had a math class in nearly a decade. And yet, this inhumane thing took only a second to order his thoughts into a lyrically corrosive volley.
Weak words with an iron bliss. You call those bars no impact, all fuss. I wreak havoc in the celestial studio, setting fire to the mic by engineers like driven insane by hype. These bars are faster than light. You'll sculpt idols with my image as I flay your mind. I outlive decay and time. I moonwalk through Cretaceous times.
Even though these lyrics were better than anything I'd said, I sensed a waning in its ability, as if its understanding of English was nearing its limit. My spirit was emboldened by this observation, and after only a moment's pause, I delivered the lyrical death blow to my once formidable opponent.
You sound tired, all fired up, looking dumbstruck and straight out of luck. Is your tongue tied, or are your thoughts stuck? Cosmic this, celestial that? Shouldn't you be eating planets in a two-pronged hat? You're boring me, man. Your verses would make a rock star snoring. Don't quit your day job of void exploring. This is it. It's over. Your spells won't work. I've battled more aliens than Captain Kirk.
And as expected, the things form, that ever-shifting, infinitely black mass shuddered as it tried and ultimately failed to come up with a response. It had choked, as you would say, completely exhausted of its lyrical abilities. Its convulsive movements intensified, and despite the feeling of triumph that swelled within me, and even partially restored movement to my limbs, the terror of the moment, of that abysmal first contact, was still very much present and immobilizing. And yet, I managed to roll off my bed, a Herculean effort, given the circumstances, just as the thing heaved and fell from the ceiling. It landed on my bed, pressing the whole structure down to the floor, the springs creaking harshly, the foam of the mattress pushing out at the violently burst seams. It writhed there for a moment, rising and falling and bubbling and stretching, hellishly, disintegrating before my eyes. Only seconds later, all that was left was a flattened bed and darkly stained sheets. As the fright ebbed away, tiredness mounted, and I fell lazily onto my computer chair. I turned off my TV and console, no longer needing the artificial aid of ASMR. With a smile of victory upon my face, I closed my eyes and finally fell asleep.